An old saying among military people is that amateurs talk about battle strategies and professionals talk about logistics. It gets to the heart of a bigger idea. Policy gets endlessly debated, and at no time more than after a change in administrations. But what about the government's capacity to do things properly? My next guest has called for a capacity agenda in 2025. She's the senior fellow at the Niskanen Center and author of Recoding America. Jennifer Pahlka joins me now. Jennifer, good to have you back.
So good to be here, Tom. Thanks so much.
You have written recently that our administrative state's structures, processes, and way of working are simply no longer fit for the jobs we need them to do. What do you mean by that?
I think people know this because we see that we make promises to the American public and then we don't really deliver on them. You know, I used to talk about it in terms of sort of people's benefits, for instance, where you can say you're eligible for something, but the process for applying is so long and insulting and difficult that, many people don't get the benefit, or if they do, they end up sort of feeling disregarded in the process. But, in the past 4 years, we had 4 huge bills, including the bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed in 2021. And we told the American public they would see things like charging stations for EVs all over the country and broadband that would roll out. And while those things are in process, and, it's not because people were lazy, they were working really hard, but we have so much accumulated process and procedure that those things that we promised aren't actually evidencing in the real world. We have, at this point, I believe, 47 EV charger stations in 15 states, now almost 4 years after signing the bill, and then 0 homes connected through the broadband plan, the BEAD program. And again, that isn't because people weren't working hard. They were working incredibly hard. It's because they're slogging through these accumulated layers of process and procedure that we really need to clean out if we're going to deliver for people in ways that they can really feel and then, really then have the trust in government we want them to have.
All right, 2 questions. One, that does raise the question of, is the government the right party to establish a network of charging stations? The government didn't build the network of gasoline stations, and so there are more efficient means and industries to do that. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, but I think in all of these things, these are funds that are going to state and local government or to private contractors to build these things, and the ecosystem needs to work better and faster and more clearly.
All right, so sticking with that example of funding for the charging stations, what needs to be cleared out? What's going on that the intent of Congress is there, the money is appropriated, and then as you point out, 3-4 years later, there's, a couple of dozen charging stations?
I don't know really what happens specifically in that. Let me take a different example, for instance, CHIPS funding, which much more has gone out. There's still stuff that will be subject to clawback by the Trump administration. But what they were charged with doing was letting companies know that this funding would be available. So pretend you're on that team. The first thing you're supposed to do really would be to stand up a form so that companies could let you know that they were interested. Well, that, for instance, that very small process of standing up a form where we let companies either apply or express interest is subject to the Paperwork Reduction Act. So instantly you're told, okay, you've done all of this work to design this form. You've had many, many stakeholders in your own agency and in other agencies that have weighed in on this. This is a lot of work. Oh, now it needs to go into a process of review by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. There's a 9-month process. Now, you can get a fast track approval, but often what that means is that you go do all the paperwork and get it done really quickly, and then 6 months later, you're going to have to do it all over again. And those laws, like PRA, were put in for very good reason, but the way they've been implemented is so onerous that it takes much more time than is really reasonable. And we need to go look at things like that and say, what are the benefits of that and what are the costs of it and how do we balance them in a different way? Because you've got federal employees working their tails off, to get through these processes when they really need to be doing is talking to those companies.
We are speaking with Jennifer Pahlka. She's senior fellow with the Niskanen Center and author of Recoding America. And also you're pointing out some issues where government doing its own thing can't get it done. One of the top citations in the article you've published, the U.S. Navy can't build ships, citing a foreign policy article. But we know that it takes sometimes 20 years from the keel laying to the operational acceptance of an aircraft carrier. And China's building ship after ship after ship after ship. And we have programs that take 20 years till the first copy is made, and they don't do what's expected. And then after 6 copies, they kill the program, say the littoral combat ship. So the government's own capacity to do what it needs for itself seems to be an issue also.
I mean, the littoral combat ships are a great example. Not only did they get delivered really late and were buggy, but also by the time they got delivered, we didn't need those ships anymore. We needed different kinds of warfighting platforms. We need different kinds of ships. We needed more drones. We're fundamentally fighting a different war 20 years later. That 20-year time frame isn't acceptable in the world we live in today.
All right. So what's the way out of this? You are suggesting a kind of capacity commission or a capacity agenda. What would that look like, and who would people such an effort?
I think that there are things that everyone can do. We talk specifically about executive branch and congressional leadership actions, but they fall under 4 basic categories. So if you want a government that can do what it says it's going to do in a reasonable time frame, fundamentally, you need to be able to do 4 things. One is hire the right people and fire the wrong ones. So we really need to look at the civil service, the rules, not just what is written into law and regulation, but the way that it is practiced, and change those practices such that we have a much healthier civil service. Hiring is super, super important in that regard. It takes far too long to hire, and we're not using assessments the way we should. We have a hopefully strong foundation with the passage of the Chance to Compete Act, but there's so much work that needs to go into implementing it that well. And we also have to look at, performance management and firing. And if you go look at the merit system principles, they're very, very strong. There's really nothing wrong with them. Our foundation is strong. But what's been built on that foundation sort of needs a full reboot. And I hope that both executive and legislative leaders will look at what to do about that. The second thing is that we need to reduce that procedural bloat that I just talked about. We've got to go say, we know that these processes and procedures were put in for good reasons, but what are the cost benefit now? Are we really, is this really the right thing for us to do given the need to work much faster and to work really more towards the public interest? We can't have this vetocracy where Congress or maybe a state legislature or a city council will pass a law saying we're going to do this, and then a very small group of people get to say, oh, no, you aren't, or many small groups of people get to say, no, that's not democracy. So we've got to reduce that procedural bloat and make it easier to get stuff done. Third, we absolutely have to invest in our digital and data infrastructure. I would love to see USDS get the funding that it needs, the Technology Transformation Service, invest in platforms, et cetera. And fourth, we really need to close the loop between policy and implementation. Now, that's going to be the hardest one because no one knows what I'm talking about when I say that. But we have a process today in which we write laws and they get sort of handed off to this hierarchy that is supposed to implement them. And we never circle back and say, is this working? What needs to be adjusted? Are we headed toward that North Star that the law or policy outlined? That's a very profound change in how government works. And it's ultimately acknowledging that the operating model in the executive branch for implementation and the operating model in legislatures is broken. And you don't fix them both separately. You put them together in such a way that we create the feedback loop that, private sector companies, for instance, really benefit from. That's how they learn fast and give
right.
people.
Yeah, there's to that point, the oversight mechanisms, say from the GAO or from inspectors general or even congressional oversight directly, is often 6 months, 2 years later, and then they spend 6 months creating the report. So maybe 2.5 years later, what went wrong with something. By then the money's gone and the credibility could be gone.
I mean, a good example is what I mentioned, the Chance to Compete Act. I'm excited about that because it says that we need to actually assess candidates for their skills rather than hiring on the basis of a match between the resume and the job description. That's not an assessment, nor is a self-assessment. Tell me if you're good at this. So Chance to Compete Act pushes at that, but it has things in it like a 3-year window to look at a platform for using assessments across agencies. That's far too long. We should be saying you need to be able to share assessments between agencies in the next 6 months, at the furthest out. we should be doing